Hello my loves, I hope that you are all doing okay. We're going to get into our story of the week because we've got a lot to get into. On the 4th of August 2011, police stopped a minicab driving through Tottenham in London. What happened in the next 26 minutes resulted in protests and riots and looting across the country as people demanded answers and justice over what happened. Today, I'm telling you the story of Mark Duggan. Welcome to the anniversary. Shwa-na-na-na, 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 shwa-na-na-na. The death of Mark Duggan is one that I think all of us will remember. The fact that it happened 9 years ago this week feels a little bit weird because it doesn't feel as if it was almost a decade ago. Although this case is so famous, I really did struggle in my research to find cold, hard facts about what happened because every single story, every single piece of information, there are so many versions of it. On the 4th of August, Mark took a taxi to Leighton in East London, where he picked up a River Island shoebox. Then he made his way back to the Broadwater Farm Estate in Tottenham. In that shoebox, the police believed there was a gun. The Trident unit had been tailing Mark and supposedly received intelligence that Mark Duggan had fired a gun, that he was storing drugs, and that he intended to take possession of a firearm. The police believed that Mark Duggan was on his way to get retribution for the killing of his cousin, Kelvin Easton, who was stabbed in East London months before, earlier in 2011. Once the police realised that Mark had already picked up the gun, that is when they mobilised. Mark apparently knew that he was being followed. He sent a BBM message to his friend saying that Trident have jammed me, indicating that he knew that his car was being followed. The police implemented a hard stop. So a hard stop is when 3 police cars block you off at the front, block you off the back, and block you off at the passenger side. Mark slid over to the other passenger side door, opened the door, and he ran. The police fired at Mark Duggan twice, and the shots hit him in the bicep and in the chest, killing him. And after shooting him, they found out that Mark Duggan was not in possession of a gun. Paramedics attended the scene, but Mark Duggan was pronounced dead at 6:41 p.m. There were many witnesses to the shooting. It was broad daylight in the middle of summer, in the middle of London. You had the taxi driver, you had people who were in their flats, people who were just on the road, and of course, the police officers. An unnamed police officer claimed that Mark Duggan was poised to shoot at the police. He even described the gun that Mark Duggan was holding. But the taxi driver said that Mark ran, he got about 3 or 4 feet away from the car when he was shot without the police announcing themselves. Some witnesses say that they heard the police tell Duggan to stop. Some say they heard the police saying, "Put it down." This is all over the place. I've read so many things about Mark Duggan being a gangster, being a drug dealer, having links to crime families in Manchester. But I just want to make something clear. He did not have a criminal record. He had never been to prison. He had never been charged with any of the offences that the police have screamed and shouted that he was involved in after his killing. It was clear that after Mark Duggan died, the police wanted to paint a picture of a gangster being taken off of the streets of London. The shooting of Mark Duggan was laced in systemic racism. Would the police have opened fire in broad daylight next to unarmed civilians if Mark Duggan was a white man? Would the police have been following him and implementing a tactical hard stop with 31 officers if he was a white man? Operation Trident, the unit that was tailing Mark Duggan, was specifically set up to police African and Caribbean communities. So I think that we can say the answers to those questions are potentially no. Things became very confusing very quickly after the killing of Mark Duggan. The smell, the musings, the rumours of a cover-up began to emerge. The longer things played out, the more suspicious everything became. The police discovered a gun about 3 to 6 metres away from where Mark Duggan had fallen, on the other side of a fence. None of the armed officers saw Mark throw a gun because he would have to have flung it over his head to get it over the fence. But apparently that was the gun that they were looking for. The police began reporting to the media almost immediately. They stated that gunfire had been exchanged, which was extremely misleading because there were only 2 shots fired and they were by the police. It took them more than 24 hours to notify the family of Mark Duggan of his death, and by then there had already been reports of somebody killed in Tottenham. The police began changing their reports, saying that Mark Duggan had drawn a gun, that he had brandished a weapon, and that he was ready to fire. The story absolutely ignited on social media, on Twitter and on Facebook. There were images of the police standing over Mark's body after they had killed him, and there were false news reports everywhere on Facebook. The racial tension, which was already very palpable, became unbearable, and everything started boiling over. The protests began on the 6th of August, 2 days after Mark Duggan was killed. At first, they began peacefully in Tottenham, and then it was reported that a 16-year-old girl threw something at the police. Some people say it was a flyer, some people say it was a stone, some people say that she was drinking champagne. But what happened ignited London. The police surrounded her and injured her. That is when the first police cars were set on fire. I've included as many links as possible for what happened during the London riots. There is so much information, and so my footage was lost, but luckily I brought my laptop to my brother's house, so we're going to get right back into it and start with the London riots. There are so many pieces of misinformation, it's super hard to get this story right. I've included as much as I possibly can in the description bar. I'm sure that you all remember where you were if you are from England when the riots began in 2011. I lived in Kensington, and I remember the looting and all the shops being set on fire, and I came back to Peckham and I went to the nail shop with my best friend Temmie, and just floods of people walking down the high street, throwing rocks, setting stores on fire. They even burnt down the Greggs, and a lot of small businesses just never recovered. I didn't go to Clapham during the London riots, but the image of that department store and those stores on fire are something that will never leave my brain. There were riots in Bristol, Birmingham, Coventry and Manchester, to name but a few. These were labelled as copycat violence, and 5 people died. Over £200 million worth of damage was caused. More than 3,000 arrests took place, and more than 1,000 convictions happened as a result of the London riots 2011. I think social media was very much to blame in continuing and inciting some of the violence and some of the acts that happened. There were broadcasts on BBM going around telling everyone where to meet, what to bring and what everyone's going to be getting up to. There were people posing with stolen items on Twitter and on Facebook, and those were used as evidence and they were shared thousands of times. Google Maps even had a thing where you could track where the riots were and what was happening live. And whilst I think it's safe to say that the protest started for a reason and it really was to get answers from the police over what had taken place, the ensuing violence and the ensuing looting was very opportunist. An inquest took place about a year after the death of Mark Duggan, and no officers who were at the scene were forced to testify. They relied on their initial reports and some statements given after. Also, all of the officers involved in the killing were granted anonymity. The inquest did not give the answers that the Duggan family and the world were waiting for. The police could not explain why their initial reports said that Mark pulled a gun, aimed a gun and even fired at officers. They could not explain why the gun that was found away from Mark's body did not contain a shred of DNA or a fingerprint, and not even the sock that it was covered in had any of Mark's prints or DNA on it. They couldn't even explain how the gun got to the other side of the fence if it indeed did belong to Mark, when 31 officers who were trained to keep their eyes on the weapon were staring at him. A jury of 8-2 voted that the death of Mark Duggan, the killing of Mark Duggan, was in fact legal, and the inquest was complete. The Met Police have never accepted liability for the killing of Mark Duggan, and they maintain that it was a legal one. In 2019, his family brought a civil claim against the Met that was settled in October, but the terms of the settlement are confidential. England has never been the same since the death of Mark Duggan and the subsequent riots. I mean, who would have thought that the death of a man in Tottenham 9 years ago would have led to one of the most violent reactions from those that were living in this country. Thank you for watching this episode of Anniversary with all the glitches and changes, scenery and all. I hope that you found it informative in the least. And I would definitely like to know what you think and where you were when the London riot started. Just drop a comment below and we can get the conversation going.